Eleanor Williams dropped her trembling cup of chamomile tea, the ceramic shattering against the cabin floor as four massive wolves emerged from the Montana darkness. At 73, with Alzheimer's stealing her memories piece by piece, she should have been terrified, but the lead wolf's amber eyes held something impossible: recognition. These weren't ordinary predators circling her isolated home. They were giants, each weighing over 100 pounds, moving with the silent coordination of a military unit. The largest female approached slowly, something bundled carefully in her massive jaws. Eleanor's arthritic hands pressed against her racing heart as fragments of memory flickered like dying embers. 20 years. Could it really be 20 years? "Hope," she whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief. "Is that you, baby girl?" The wolf's tail wagged once, a gesture so achingly familiar it brought tears to Eleanor's clouded eyes. In that moment, past and present collided with devastating clarity. What had brought them back after 2 decades? And what precious cargo did Hope carry that seemed more important than her own survival? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 20 years earlier, Eleanor Williams had been a different woman entirely. At 53, she possessed the quiet strength that comes from surviving life's cruelest blows, though the weight of recent losses had carved deep lines around her once bright eyes. The remote cabin in northwestern Montana, tucked between towering pines and overlooking Glacier National Park, had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The place wasn't even legally hers. When Robert died in that construction accident, a faulty crane that crushed him instantly while she waited at home with his favorite pot roast growing cold, Eleanor discovered their savings had evaporated into medical bills from his previous heart surgery. The insurance company found loopholes, the lawyers found excuses, and she found herself with nothing but Social Security checks that barely covered groceries. The abandoned ranger station had been empty for 3 years when Eleanor quietly moved in. Built in the 1960s during the height of the Cold War, it featured reinforced walls and a hidden basement that most people had forgotten existed. She told herself it was temporary, just until she figured things out. But deep down, she knew better. At her age, with her resources, there was nowhere else to go. The isolation might have driven her mad if not for the conversation she held each evening with Robert's ashes, carefully arranged on the mantel beside their wedding photo. "Another day, honey," she'd whisper, settling into his old recliner with a cup of weak coffee. "Still not ready to join you yet." The ritual kept her sane, kept her tethered to something resembling normalcy. Her nursing background served her well in the wilderness. 40 years of caring for others had taught her to notice details, to read symptoms, to provide comfort when medicine failed. She treated her own ailments with the same clinical detachment she'd once shown patients, monitoring her blood pressure, rationing her heart medication, accepting that her hands shook more each month from a combination of arthritis and grief. The approaching winter of 2004 promised to be harsh. Old-timers at the general store 15 miles away spoke of early snows and bitter cold, the kind that killed the unprepared. Eleanor stocked her pantry with canned goods and split wood until her back screamed in protest. She'd survived Vietnam as a young Army nurse, buried her husband and son, and endured poverty that would have broken lesser souls. A Montana winter held no terror for her. But loneliness was different. Loneliness crept in during the long evenings when even Robert's ashes couldn't fill the silence. She found herself talking to the wind, to the trees, to the occasional deer that wandered past her windows. Sometimes she caught herself setting 2 plates for dinner, forgetting for precious moments that she was the only living soul for miles. "I'm not ready for the grave yet," she told Robert's photo each night, though some mornings she wondered if that was still true. Purpose had abandoned her along with everyone she'd ever loved. She was simply existing, waiting for something, anything, to remind her that life still held meaning worth fighting for. The October morning that changed everything began like any other, with Eleanor shuffling to her kitchen window while her coffee brewed. The first snow had fallen overnight, dusting the pine branches with crystalline beauty that reminded her of the Christmas mornings when Michael was small. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, watching her breath fog the surface as memories threatened to overwhelm her fragile composure. It was the whimpering that broke through her reverie, a sound so faint she almost dismissed it as wind through the trees. But 30 years of nursing had trained her to recognize distress, and this was unmistakably the cry of something young and helpless. Eleanor pulled on Robert's old hunting jacket, grabbed the emergency medical kit she'd assembled from leftover nursing supplies, and stepped into the bitter morning air. The sound led her toward Willow Creek, where the water ran shallow over smooth stones. What she found there stopped her heart completely. 4 tiny wolf cubs, no more than 6 weeks old, huddled together beside their mother's lifeless body. The adult female lay partially concealed beneath fallen branches, her beautiful gray coat matted with blood, foam dried around her muzzle. Eleanor had seen enough death to recognize poisoning when she saw it. The cubs were barely alive. Their eyes, recently opened, were clouded with exhaustion and hypothermia. The smallest one, a female with distinctive white markings on her chest, had stopped shivering entirely, a sign that death was claiming her. Eleanor knelt in the snow, her arthritic knees protesting, and gathered the tiny bodies against her chest. They were so light, so fragile, like the premature babies she'd cared for in the hospital's NICU decades ago. "Oh, babies," she whispered, feeling their rapid heartbeats against her ribs. "Where's your pack? Where's your family?" But even as she asked, Eleanor knew the answer. Wolves had been hunted to near extinction in Montana, their numbers only recently beginning to recover under federal protection. These cubs were likely the last of their bloodline, orphaned by some rancher's illegal poison trap. The walk back to the cabin felt endless. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, not from exertion, but from the magnitude of what she was contemplating. Harboring wolves was a federal crime under the Endangered Species Act, punishable by massive fines and prison time. At her age, with her health, a prison sentence would be a death sentence. But as she looked down at the dying cubs in her arms, she heard Michael's voice from 20 years ago. "Mom, sometimes doing what's right means breaking what's wrong." Inside the warm cabin, Eleanor spread old towels on the kitchen table and began the delicate work of saving lives. She checked each cub for injuries, finding only malnutrition and severe dehydration. From her medical supplies, she retrieved infant feeding tubes and electrolyte solutions, equipment she'd saved from her nursing days just in case. Working with steady hands, despite her arthritis, she tube-fed each cub, watching their tiny bellies expand with life-giving nutrition. The largest male, solid black with intelligent amber eyes, was the strongest. He latched onto the feeding tube eagerly, his tiny paws kneading Eleanor's palm the way kittens knead their mothers. The 2 middle cubs, both gray with darker markings, showed more fight once they'd been warmed and fed. But the smallest female worried Eleanor most. She remained listless, her breathing shallow and irregular. "Come on, little one," Eleanor murmured, cradling the tiny she-wolf against her chest. "I know you're tired, but you can't give up. I won't let you." She thought of all the time she'd willed strength into failing patience, refusing to accept death's inevitability. This felt the same, a battle for life fought with love instead of medicine. As evening fell, Eleanor faced the full weight of her decision. She'd committed a federal crime that could destroy what remained of her life. The rational choice was to call the Department of Fish and Wildlife, report the cubs, and let the authorities handle their fate. But Eleanor knew what that meant. Euthanasia for cubs too young to survive in captivity, too dependent to return to the wild. "I couldn't save my son," she told Robert's ashes as the cubs slept in a nest of blankets beside the fireplace. "But maybe I can save these babies. Maybe that's why God brought them to me." The smallest female stirred at the sound of her voice, those cloudy blue eyes focusing with what Eleanor chose to interpret as trust. She named them that night, whispering their new identities as they slept. Hope for the white-chested female who'd fought hardest for life, faith for the gentle gray male who'd accepted her care without struggle, courage for the bold black male who'd shown immediate strength, and spirit for the independent gray female who'd tried to crawl away even while dying. "We're a family now," Eleanor whispered into the firelit darkness. "God help us all, we're a family." November brought the first real threat to Eleanor's secret family in the form of Marcus Thompson, a man whose hatred ran deeper than the Montana frost. At 45, the newly transferred park ranger carried himself with military precision, his weathered face bearing the permanent scowl of someone who'd seen too much darkness. When he introduced himself at Eleanor's door that gray morning, his pale blue eyes swept past her with the calculating gaze of a predator. "Ma'am, I'm Ranger Thompson, investigating reports of unusual animal activity in this area," he said, his voice carrying a slight Alaskan accent that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Mind if I ask a few questions?" Eleanor clutched her worn cardigan tighter, grateful that the cubs were safely hidden in the reinforced basement she'd discovered during her first week in the cabin. The Cold War-era bunker, accessible through a concealed hatch beneath her kitchen pantry, had become their nursery. "Of course, Ranger. Though I can't imagine what help I'd be. I barely see another soul out here." Marcus's smile never reached his eyes. "That's exactly why your observations matter, Mrs. Williams?" "Eleanor Williams." She stepped aside reluctantly, knowing that refusing entry would raise suspicions. "Would you like some coffee? It's bitter cold out there." As Marcus settled at her kitchen table, Eleanor fought to keep her hands steady while pouring coffee. Below them she knew hope, faith, courage, and spirit were sleeping in their warm nest of blankets, fed and content after their morning bottle feeding. At 8 weeks old, they'd begun showing their individual personalities: hope's fierce protectiveness, faith's gentle curiosity, courage's bold playfulness, and spirit's independent streak. "Mrs. Williams, I'll be frank with you," Marcus said, his fingers drumming against the table. "We've had several reports of livestock predation in this area. Sheep killed in a pattern consistent with wolf activity." His jaw tightened. "I've made it my personal mission to eliminate the wolf threat in this region." Something in his tone made Eleanor's blood run cold. This wasn't just professional duty. It was personal vendetta. "Wolves. I thought they were protected by federal law." "Protection has limits when public safety is at stake," Marcus replied, his hand unconsciously moving to the service pistol at his hip. "A pack killed my 8-year-old daughter in Alaska 6 years ago, tore her apart while she played in our backyard." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Sarah was feeding a stray dog when they came out of the woods. Found pieces of her scattered across 50 yards of snow." Eleanor's heart clenched with sympathy even as terror gripped her. "I'm so sorry for your loss. That must have been devastating." "It was." Marcus stood abruptly, moving toward her kitchen window that overlooked the forest. "But I've learned something important since then. Wolves aren't the noble creatures environmentalists pretend they are. They're killers, pure and simple. And I won't rest until every last one is eliminated from areas where families live." Below the floorboards, Eleanor heard the faintest scratching sound, one of the cubs stirring in their sleep. She coughed loudly to mask the noise, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Have you actually seen any wolves in this area?" Marcus turned back to her, those pale eyes searching. "Not yet, but I know they're here. I can smell them." He walked slowly around her small kitchen, his gaze taking in every detail. "You live alone out here, Mrs. Williams. If wolves are in this area, you're in serious danger. I hope you'll call me immediately if you see or hear anything unusual." "Of course," Eleanor managed, accepting his business card with trembling fingers. "Though honestly, at my age, I might not be the most reliable witness. Sometimes I think I hear things that aren't there." "Don't sell yourself short," Marcus said, his voice carrying an edge that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Old folks often notice things younger people miss. In fact—" He paused, tilting his head slightly. "Do you hear that?" Eleanor's blood turned to ice water. From below came the unmistakable sound of a wolf cub's whimper, hope calling for her morning feeding. The sound was faint but distinct, and Marcus's trained ear had caught it immediately. "Hear what?" Eleanor asked, forcing confusion into her voice. "I'm afraid my hearing isn't what it used to be." Marcus remained perfectly still, listening. After what felt like an eternity, he shook his head. "Probably just the wind through the trees. But Mrs. Williams, I want you to promise me something." He leaned closer, his presence suddenly menacing. "If you encounter wolves, don't try to be a hero. Don't try to feed them or help them. They may look pitiful, especially the young ones, but they're born killers. The kindest thing you can do is call me immediately so I can eliminate the threat." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. As Marcus gathered his jacket and prepared to leave, he paused at her door. "One more thing," he said, his hand resting on the doorframe. "I'll be conducting regular patrols in this area over the winter. Don't be alarmed if you see my truck or if I stop by to check on you. A woman alone in the wilderness faces many dangers." After he left, Eleanor sank into her chair, her entire body shaking. She waited 20 minutes before lifting the concealed hatch to the basement, where 4 fuzzy faces looked up at her with trusting eyes. Hope, already showing signs of becoming the pack's alpha, stood on unsteady legs and tried to climb toward Eleanor's voice. "Oh, babies," Eleanor whispered, gathering them close. "We're in so much more danger than I thought." She thought of Marcus's dead daughter, understanding his hatred while fearing its consequences for her secret family. The man wasn't just doing his job. He was hunting wolves with the fury of personal vengeance. That night, as the cub slept against her chest by the fireplace, Eleanor made a terrible calculation. Marcus would return, and when he did, he'd be watching more carefully. The cubs were growing rapidly, their wolf characteristics becoming more pronounced each day. Soon, hiding them would become impossible. "Robert," she whispered to her husband's ashes, "I think I've bitten off more than I can chew this time." The confrontation Eleanor had dreaded for months finally came on a crystalline October morning in 2005, exactly 1 year after she'd found 4 dying wolf cubs by Willow Creek. The wolves were now magnificent adults, Hope standing nearly 3 feet tall at the shoulder, her white chest markings bold against her silver-gray coat, while Courage had grown into a massive black male whose amber eyes held fierce intelligence. Faith and Spirit, the middle siblings, moved with the fluid grace of apex predators, their bond with Eleanor deeper than anything she'd experienced since losing her own family. Eleanor had risen before dawn to prepare for what she knew would be their final goodbye. At 74, with her heart condition worsening and winter approaching, she could no longer provide the care they needed. More importantly, Marcus Thompson's patrols had intensified, his surveillance equipment appearing throughout the forest like a spider's web designed to catch her secret family. She'd chosen the meadow where she'd first taught them to hunt, a secluded clearing 2 miles from the cabin where ancient pines formed a natural amphitheater. The morning mist clung to the grass as Eleanor spread her late husband's military blanket on the ground, her arthritic hands shaking as she unpacked what she thought of as their last supper together. 4 thick steaks she'd bought with her grocery money, premium cuts that had cost more than she spent on food for herself in a month. "Come here, babies," she called softly, using the whistle command she'd developed over the past year. The response was immediate and heartbreaking. All 4 wolves emerged from the tree line with the silent coordination that marked them as a true pack, their eyes fixed on Eleanor with absolute devotion. Hope reached her first, as always, pressing her massive head against Eleanor's chest in the gesture that had become their morning greeting. "I know, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, her voice already thick with unshed tears. "I know you don't understand why this has to happen." She knelt on the blanket, her knees protesting, and gathered them close. Faith rested his head on her lap, while spirit and courage flanked her sides, their warm bodies providing comfort she knew she'd never feel again. For an hour, Eleanor simply held them, memorizing the feel of their fur, the sound of their breathing, the weight of their trust. She told them stories about Robert and Michael, about the life she'd lived before they came to save her from unbearable loneliness. "You gave me a reason to live when I had none left," she murmured into Hope's fur. "But now I have to give you the greatest gift I can. Your freedom." The steaks disappeared quickly, the wolves eating with the enthusiasm they'd shown as cubs. Eleanor laughed through her tears as courage playfully stole a piece from Spirit's portion, earning him a tolerant nip from his sister. These moments of normal pack behavior reminded her that beneath their love for her, they remained wild creatures with instincts that called them toward a life she could never provide. As the sun climbed higher, Eleanor began the most difficult speech of her life. "Listen to me, all of you," she said, using the firm tone that had always commanded their attention. "You're not pets, and you never were. You're wolves. Beautiful, magnificent wolves who deserve to live free." Hope's ears flattened against her skull, sensing the distress in Eleanor's voice. "I've taught you everything I can about avoiding humans, about hunting, about staying safe. Now you need to use those lessons." The goodbye ritual she'd planned involved releasing them one by one, starting with Spirit, who'd always shown the strongest independent streak. But as Eleanor stood and pointed toward the deep forest, calling out the command she'd never wanted to use, "Go! Go live!" Spirit sat down and refused to move. Her intelligent brown eyes held a stubbornness that reminded Eleanor painfully of Michael at that age. "Please, baby girl," Eleanor pleaded, her voice breaking. "This isn't a game. You have to go now while you still can." But Spirit simply tilted her head and whined, the sound so full of confusion and hurt that Eleanor nearly collapsed. That's when the first gunshot shattered the morning silence. Eleanor spun toward the sound, her blood turning to ice as she saw Marcus Thompson emerging from the tree line 50 yards away. He wore full tactical gear, bulletproof vest, military-style helmet, and carried what looked like a high-powered rifle with a scope. Behind him came 2 other men in similar gear, their faces hidden behind dark visors. "Step away from the animals, Mrs." "Williams," Marcus called out, his voice amplified by some kind of electronic device. "Step away now and you won't be harmed." Eleanor's protective instincts flared with an intensity that surprised her. She moved between Marcus and her wolves, spreading her arms wide despite knowing how futile the gesture was. "Don't you dare!" she shouted, her voice carrying across the meadow with surprising strength. "They're not hurting anyone." "Those are federally protected wolves that you've been harboring illegally for over a year," Marcus replied, advancing slowly with his weapon raised. "But more importantly, they're killers trained by a delusional old woman who doesn't understand the danger she's created. Behind Eleanor, the wolves had formed their own defensive line. Hope moved to Eleanor's right side, her hackles raised and a low growl rumbling from her chest. Courage positioned himself on the left, while Faith and Spirit flanked them, creating a protective semicircle around their human pack leader. "They've never hurt anyone!" Eleanor screamed, her heart hammering so hard she feared it might stop entirely. "All they've ever done is love me and trust me, and now you want to murder them for that?" Marcus's laugh was cold and bitter. "Love? Trust? Mrs. Williams, you've been living in a fantasy. These animals are apex predators with zero fear of humans because of your interference. Do you have any idea how dangerous that makes them?" He gestured toward his companions, who began spreading out to flank the group. "When they get hungry enough, when their natural instincts kick in, they'll kill the first human they encounter. And thanks to you, they'll associate people with easy prey." Eleanor felt Hope's nose nudge her hand, and she looked down to see those amber eyes gazing up at her with absolute trust. In that moment, she realized that everything Marcus said might be true. She might have created a danger she never intended. But she also knew, with the certainty that comes from a year of daily interaction, that these wolves would die before harming her. "You're wrong," she said quietly, her voice caring despite its softness. "You're wrong because you're letting your grief make you blind to the truth. These wolves aren't your daughter's killers. They're not killers at all." Marcus's face twisted with rage behind his visor. "Don't you dare mention my daughter!" The rifle's muzzle swung toward Hope, and Eleanor saw his finger move to the trigger. "That beautiful little girl died because people like you spread fairy tales about wolves being harmless." Time slowed to a crawl. Eleanor saw Marcus's finger tighten, saw Hope's ears prick forward as she sensed the immediate danger, saw Courage's muscles coil as he prepared to launch himself at their attacker. In that crystalline moment, Eleanor made the only choice her heart would allow. She threw herself forward, directly into the line of fire. The bullet meant for Hope struck Eleanor in the right shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through her body, white-hot and overwhelming, but through it all she heard the most terrifying sound of her life: 4 adult wolves howling in anguish and fury. What happened next would haunt Marcus Thompson for the rest of his life. Instead of attacking him as he'd expected, the wolves surrounded Eleanor's fallen body. Hope pressed her muzzle against Eleanor's face, whining softly, while the others formed a protective circle, their growls directed at the armed men, but their attention focused entirely on their injured pack leader. "Eleanor!" Marcus dropped his weapon and ran forward, his companions following. "Jesus Christ, what have I done?" He fell to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he tried to assess her injuries. "I never meant to." She jumped in front of. Eleanor's vision was graying at the edges, but she could still feel Hope's warm breath on her cheek. "Don't hurt them," she gasped, blood frothing at her lips. "Please, they're just protecting their family." Marcus looked around at the 4 massive wolves who could have torn him apart but instead maintained their vigil over Eleanor. For the first time in 6 years, doubt crept into his certainty about the nature of wolves. These animals weren't behaving like the monsters who'd killed Sarah. They were behaving like family. "Radio for medical evacuation," he told one of his companions, his voice hollow. "Now!" As consciousness faded, Eleanor heard Hope's mournful howl echoing across the mountains, calling to something ancient and wild. The sound spoke of loyalty that transcended species, of love that knew no boundaries, and of loss that cut deeper than any bullet ever could. The last thing Eleanor saw before darkness claimed her was Hope's amber eyes, filled with a grief so profound it seemed to hold the sorrow of the entire world. The helicopter's rotors beat against the morning sky like mechanical thunder as paramedics fought to stabilize Eleanor's failing body. Through the haze of morphine and shock, she could hear Marcus Thompson's voice breaking over the radio. "We need a full trauma team standing by. Gunshot wound to the shoulder. Possible cardiac complications. Victim is elderly with pre-existing conditions." His words seemed to come from underwater, distorted and strange, but the anguish in his tone was unmistakable. Eleanor's last glimpse of the meadow showed 4 silhouettes against the tree line. Hope, faith, courage, and spirit, watching their world disappear into the sky. She tried to call out to them, to offer some final comfort, but the ventilator tube prevented any sound except the mechanical wheeze of artificial breathing. Tears leaked from her closed eyes as consciousness slipped away, carrying with it the weight of knowing she might never see her family again. The surgery at Kalispell Regional Medical Center lasted 6 hours. The bullet had shattered Eleanor's shoulder blade and nicked a major artery, requiring multiple transfusions and delicate vascular repair. But the real damage was to her heart. The stress of the shooting had triggered a massive cardiac episode that left her clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. Dr. Sarah Chen, the trauma surgeon who'd fought to save her, delivered the verdict with gentle finality. "Mrs. Williams is stable for now, but her prognosis is guarded. The next 48 hours will be critical." Eleanor awoke 3 days later to find herself shackled to the hospital bed with federal restraints. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd survived being shot defending wolves, only to find herself treated like a criminal. Agent Rebecca Morris, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, sat beside her bed, a stack of documents in her lap and an expression of professional sympathy on her face. "Mrs. Williams, I'm Agent Morris. I need to inform you that you're under federal arrest for violations of the Endangered Species Act." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows. The charges include unlawful possession of protected wildlife, interfering with federal wildlife management, and creating a public safety hazard. Eleanor's voice came out as a whisper, her throat raw from the ventilator. Where are my wolves?" Agent Morris's expression softened slightly. "That's what we need to discuss. We've had teams searching for them since the incident, but they've vanished completely. Ranger Thompson believes they may have fled into Canada." She leaned forward, her voice taking on a more personal tone. "Mrs. Williams, these animals have been living with humans for over a year. They have no fear of people, which makes them extremely dangerous. We need your help to locate them before someone gets hurt." The next weeks blurred together in a haze of legal proceedings and medical consultations. Eleanor's court-appointed attorney, a young public defender named James Fletcher, painted a grim picture. She faced up to 18 months in federal prison and a fine of $100,000, money she didn't have and never would. Her tiny Social Security payments had been frozen pending the outcome of her case, leaving her dependent on Medicare for medical care and the goodwill of overworked hospital staff for everything else. "Mrs. Williams, I have to be honest with you," Fletcher said during one of their brief meetings in the hospital's security wing. "The prosecution has an airtight case. You admitted to harboring the wolves, and there's physical evidence throughout your cabin. Our only hope is to negotiate a plea bargain based on your age and medical condition." But Eleanor barely heard him. Her thoughts remained fixed on 4 wolves somewhere in the wilderness, facing their first winter without human support. Had she taught them enough to survive? Could they find adequate shelter? Would they remember her warnings about avoiding humans, or had her own capture taught them that people were enemies to be feared? The media attention was merciless. Wolf Woman became a national sensation, with cable news programs debating her case nightly. Some painted her as a delusional old woman whose misguided compassion had created a public menace. Others portrayed her as a folk hero, a modern-day St. Francis defending innocent creatures against government overreach. Eleanor watched the debates from her hospital bed with growing despair, knowing that every minute of coverage made it less likely her wolves would remain safely hidden. Marcus Thompson visited her exactly once, 3 weeks after the shooting. He stood at the foot of her bed like a man attending his own execution, his face drawn and haunted. The confident ranger who'd hunted her wolves had been replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Mrs. Williams," he began, his voice barely audible. I needed to." He stopped, swallowing hard. "I've been hunting wolves for 6 years, convinced they were all monsters. But what I saw in that meadow—" He looked directly into her eyes for the first time. Those animals weren't trying to hurt anyone. They were protecting their family. Eleanor studied his face, seeing genuine anguish there. "What happened to your daughter, Marcus? What really happened?" His composure cracked completely. "Sarah was killed by a drunk driver," he whispered. "A drunk driver who happened to be me." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. "I'd been drinking after losing my job, and I hit her with my own truck in our driveway. She was 7, not 8. And there were no wolves." Eleanor felt her heart breaking for this broken man. Why the lie? Why blame wolves? "Because I couldn't live with the truth," Marcus said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "It was easier to hunt animals than face what I'd done to my own child. I created this story about wolves killing her because it gave me something to fight besides myself." He pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "I've submitted my resignation to the Park Service, and I've written a full confession about falsifying evidence in several wolf cases." After he left, Eleanor stared at the ceiling tiles until they blurred into meaninglessness. Every person connected to her story seemed to be carrying unbearable guilt. Marcus for his daughter's death, herself for potentially dooming her wolves, even the young nurse who'd accidentally mentioned seeing wolves near the hospital grounds before catching herself and falling silent. The final blow came on a gray November morning when Dr. Chen delivered news that Eleanor had been dreading. "Mrs. Williams, we've completed all the neurological testing you requested. I'm afraid the results confirm our suspicions." She sat down heavily, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine sadness. "You're showing early-stage symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. The progression appears to be accelerated, possibly due to the trauma you've experienced." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the last pieces of her world crumble away. "How long do I have before I'm not myself anymore?" "It's impossible to predict exactly, but based on your current rate of decline, you may have 6 months to 2 years of relatively clear cognition. After that—" Dr. Chen's voice trailed off, unable to voice the inevitable. That night, Eleanor lay awake listening to the sounds of the hospital. Distant voices, mechanical beeps, the shuffle of late-shift nurses making their rounds. Somewhere in the wilderness, 4 wolves were learning to survive without her. Somewhere in a federal prosecutor's office, documents were being prepared to send her to prison for the crime of loving too deeply. And somewhere in her own failing mind, the memories that defined her were beginning their slow fade into darkness. She thought about Robert's ashes, still sitting on the mantel in a cabin she'd never see again. She thought about Michael's final letter from Iraq, promising to come home for Christmas. She thought about 4 tiny cubs who'd chosen to trust her completely, and how that trust had led them all to this moment of absolute devastation. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the darkness, addressing Robert, Michael, hope, faith, courage, and spirit all at once. "I'm so sorry I failed you all." Outside her window, the first snow of winter began to fall, each flake catching the parking lot lights like tears from heaven. Eleanor watched until exhaustion claimed her, carrying her into dreams where she was young again, where her family was alive, and where 4 wolf cubs slept peacefully beside a warm fire, safe from a world that seemed determined to destroy everything beautiful. The monitors beside her bed beeped steadily through the night, marking time in a life that had become nothing more than a countdown to endings she could no longer prevent or postpone. The truth began unraveling on a bitter December morning when FBI agent Susan Crawford arrived at Kalispell Regional Medical Center with a manila folder that would change everything. Eleanor had been transferred to the psychiatric wing after a series of episodes where she'd been found talking to empty chairs, convinced that Robert and Michael were visiting her. The federal charges still hung over her like a sword, but her deteriorating mental state had complicated the prosecution's timeline. Agent Crawford pulled up a chair beside Eleanor's bed, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Williams, I need to show you something that's going to be difficult to process." She opened the folder, revealing crime scene photographs and official reports. "We've been investigating Ranger Thompson's activities over the past 6 years, and we've discovered some disturbing inconsistencies." Eleanor struggled to focus through the fog of medication and memory loss. Some days she couldn't remember her own name, while others brought painful clarity that made her wish for the confusion. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "Marcus Thompson's daughter wasn't killed by wolves, Mrs. Williams. She died in a car accident in his driveway, an accident he caused while driving under the influence." Crawford's voice remained professional, but Eleanor could hear the anger beneath it. "He falsified every report about wolf attacks in his jurisdiction. The livestock killings he blamed on wolves were actually caused by feral dogs and coyotes. In some cases, he planted evidence to support his claims." The revelation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. "You mean my wolves never hurt anyone?" "That's correct. In fact, our investigation has revealed something remarkable." Crawford pulled out a different set of photographs, trail camera images showing 4 large wolves moving through the forest. "Your wolves have been protecting livestock, not attacking it." "We have footage of them chasing away coyote packs and feral dogs. They seem to have learned to distinguish between threats and innocent animals." Eleanor's hands shook as she studied the images. There was hope, magnificent and powerful, leading her siblings through snow-covered terrain. Faith and spirit flanked a small herd of deer, not hunting them, but apparently guiding them away from a road where cars posed danger. Courage stood sentinel on a ridge, his massive frame silhouetted against the sky like a guardian spirit. "But why didn't they attack the livestock themselves?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. Agent Crawford leaned forward, her professional mask slipping to reveal something approaching wonder. "That's the extraordinary part, Mrs. Williams. Analysis of the footage suggests your wolves learned human behavioral patterns from you. They understand the concept of protection rather than predation when it comes to domesticated animals. It's unprecedented in wildlife management literature." The weight of this revelation was staggering. Eleanor had spent months in agony, believing she'd created dangerous animals who would inevitably hurt innocent people. Instead, she'd apparently raised wolves who understood the moral complexities of living near human civilization, a concept that should have been impossible for wild animals to grasp. "There's more," Crawford continued, producing another document. "Marcus Thompson has agreed to cooperate fully with our investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony has revealed a pattern of evidence tampering, illegal wildlife killings, and falsified reports spanning multiple states. Dozens of wolves were killed based on his manufactured evidence." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but she wasn't sure if they came from relief or overwhelming grief. "What about my charges?" "What about the wolves? All federal charges against you are being dropped immediately. Furthermore, the Department of Fish and Wildlife is prepared to offer you an unprecedented arrangement." Crawford's voice took on an almost excited tone. "We want to hire you as a consultant on wolf rehabilitation and human-wildlife coexistence. Your wolves have demonstrated behaviors we've never seen before. They could revolutionize our understanding of predator intelligence and social learning. But even as relief flooded through her, Eleanor felt the cruel irony of timing. Her mind was deteriorating rapidly. Some days she couldn't remember how to use a telephone or recognize the faces of hospital staff she'd known for months. "Agent Crawford, I appreciate what you're offering, but I can't." She gestured helplessly at her own confusion. "I have Alzheimer's. Some days I don't even remember my own name." Crawford's expression softened with genuine compassion. "We know about your diagnosis, Mrs. Williams, but we also know that you have periods of clarity, and your knowledge about those wolves is invaluable. We're not asking you to do anything strenuous, just share your observations and experiences with our research team." The conversation was interrupted by Dr. Chen, who entered with Eleanor's latest test results. "Mrs. Williams, I have some updates on your condition." She glanced at Agent Crawford uncertainly. "It's all right," Eleanor said. "Agent Crawford is here about the wolves. Whatever you have to say, she can hear it." Dr. Chen sat down, her expression grave. "The latest scans show that your cognitive decline is progressing faster than we initially projected. We're seeing significant deterioration in the areas of the brain responsible for short-term memory and executive function." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm afraid you may have weeks rather than months of reliable cognition remaining." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. Eleanor absorbed this news with the strange calm that comes from having already lost everything that mattered. "How long before I don't recognize myself in the mirror?" "It's impossible to predict exactly, but based on the current progression, you may experience severe cognitive impairment within the next month or two." Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but honest. "We can make you comfortable, and there are medications that might slow the progression slightly, but I'm dying," Eleanor finished quietly. "My mind is dying, and eventually my body will follow." She looked out the window at the snow-covered parking lot, thinking of 4 wolves somewhere in that vast wilderness. "At least they're free. At least I gave them that." Agent Crawford cleared her throat softly. "Mrs. Williams, there's something else I need to tell you. Something that might change how you feel about your situation." She pulled out one final photograph, a trail camera image that took Eleanor's breath away. The picture showed Hope standing in a small clearing, but she wasn't alone. 3 smaller wolves flanked her, juveniles, clearly her offspring. Even in the grainy trail camera footage, Eleanor could see the distinctive white markings on the smallest one's chest, an exact replica of Hope's unique pattern. "Your wolves have established a pack," Crawford said softly. "Hope has had cubs, and Faith has mated with a wild female who joined their group. They're not just surviving, Mrs. Williams, they're thriving. The behaviors you taught them have been passed on to a new generation." Eleanor stared at the photograph until her vision blurred with tears. Somewhere in the wilderness, her grandbabies, actual wolf grandbabies, were learning the lessons she'd taught their parents. The love and protection she'd given to 4 orphaned cubs was rippling forward through generations, creating something unprecedented in the wild. "There's a proposal I want to make," Agent Crawford continued. "We know your time is limited, but we'd like to arrange for you to see them again. Our research team has been developing non-invasive observation protocols, and we believe we can set up a situation where you could observe your pack from a safe distance." Dr. Chen immediately protested. "Agent Crawford, Mrs. Williams is in no condition for wilderness expeditions. Her heart condition alone—" "I don't care about my heart condition," Eleanor interrupted, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I don't care about anything except seeing them one more time." She looked directly at Agent Crawford. When? We could arrange something within the next week if you're willing. It would involve a helicopter transport to an observation blind we've established. You'd be accompanied by a full medical team, and we'd have evacuation protocols in place. Crawford's voice carried the urgency of someone who understood they were racing against time. Mrs. Williams, what you accomplished with those wolves could change wildlife management forever. Your story deserves a proper ending. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate hope that had sustained her through the darkest days of her legal troubles, but a quiet, peaceful hope that her life had mattered. That the love she'd given to 4 orphaned creatures had created something beautiful and lasting. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I want to see my babies one more time. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, but for the first time in months, Eleanor didn't see it as a symbol of ending. Instead, she saw it as a blanket covering the world where her family lived free, where love had triumphed over fear, and where an old woman's final act of devotion was about to come full circle in ways she could never have imagined. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, but now they seemed to be counting down to a reunion rather than an ending. 20 years passed like pages torn from a calendar, each one carrying Eleanor Williams further from the world she'd known and deeper into the gentle fog of Alzheimer's disease. Now, 73 and living in the same remote cabin where her extraordinary story had begun, she spent her days in a carefully managed routine maintained by visiting nurses and a rotating team of wildlife researchers who'd made her something of a living legend in conservation circles. The cabin had been transformed into a comfortable care facility, with medical equipment discreetly integrated among Eleanor's cherished possessions. Robert's ashes still occupied their place of honor on the mantel, and Eleanor continued her evening conversations with him, though now she sometimes forgot he was gone and set 2 places for dinner. Her memory had become a patchwork quilt, some days crystal clear, others lost in confusion that left her calling for Michael, or searching for wolves that lived only in her fading recollections. Dr. Amanda Foster, the geriatrician who'd overseen Eleanor's care for the past decade, had prepared her team for this day. Eleanor's cognitive decline had reached a critical point where she required constant supervision, but her physical health remained surprisingly robust for her age. She's defying every prediction we made, Dr. Foster had told the research team. Her connection to this place, to her memories of the wolves, seems to be keeping her anchored longer than medical science would suggest possible. On this particular January evening, Eleanor sat in her favorite chair by the window, wrapped in Robert's old military blanket and watching snow fall through the gathering darkness. Her current caregiver, a gentlewoman named Patricia, was preparing dinner when Eleanor suddenly straightened, her clouded eyes focusing with startling clarity. "Patricia!" she called, her voice carrying an urgency that made the nurse hurry to her side. "There's something out there. In the trees." Patricia looked through the window but saw only falling snow and dark forest. Eleanor's episodes of confusion often involved seeing things that weren't there, sometimes Robert working in the garden, sometimes Michael as a child playing in the snow. "It's just the wind in the trees, honey. Nothing to worry about." But Eleanor was pressing her face against the glass, her breath fogging the window as she stared intently into the darkness. "No, there's definitely something." She stopped mid-sentence, her entire body going rigid. "Oh my God! Oh my sweet God!" 4 massive shapes emerged from the tree line, moving with the silent coordination of apex predators. Even in the dim light from the cabin windows, their size was unmistakable. These were enormous wolves, far larger than any wild specimens Patricia had ever seen in nature documentaries. The lead wolf, a magnificent female with distinctive white markings on her chest, approached the cabin with cautious deliberation. "Eleanor, we need to get away from the window," Patricia said, reaching for the emergency phone to call the wildlife authorities. Those are Hope, Eleanor whispered, and Patricia froze at the tone of absolute certainty in her voice. That's hope, and faith, and spirit, and courage. Eleanor's hands pressed against the glass, trembling with emotion that seemed to burn away years of confusion. My babies came home. The lead wolf, Hope, approached the cabin door and sat down, her amber eyes fixed on Eleanor's face through the window. Behind her, 3 other wolves maintained their positions, but Patricia could see something extraordinary in their behavior. These weren't wild animals stalking prey, they were family members arriving for a long-awaited reunion. Hope lifted her massive head and released a sound that Patricia would remember for the rest of her life, a low, mournful howl that seemed to carry 20 years of separation and longing. The sound was answered immediately by her packmates, creating a harmony that resonated through the forest and seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. Eleanor was crying now, tears streaming down her weathered face as she struggled to stand. I have to go to them. I have to. But her legs, weakened by age and inactivity, wouldn't support her weight. Eleanor, you can't go outside. It's not safe, Patricia protested. But even as she spoke, she was witnessing something that challenged everything she thought she knew about wild animals. Hope approached the door and placed something carefully on the threshold, a bundle wrapped in what appeared to be soft fur and dried grasses. Then she backed away and sat down again, her intelligent eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. The message was unmistakable. This was a gift, delivered with the same care a mother might show when presenting a treasure to her child. They brought me something, Eleanor said, her voice filled with wonder. After all these years, they brought me a gift. She looked at Patricia with eyes that held more clarity than they'd shown in months. Please, I know you think I'm just a confused old woman, but those wolves raised families out there. They've been watching over me all these years, and now they've come back for a reason. Patricia found herself reaching for the door handle despite every instinct screaming that this was dangerous beyond measure. But something in Eleanor's certainty, combined with the obviously non-threatening behavior of the wolves, made her hesitate. What if they attack? They won't, Eleanor said with absolute confidence. They're not here to hurt anyone. They're here because they know. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They know I'm dying. As if responding to her words, Hope rose and approached the window again. She placed her massive paws against the glass, standing on her hind legs so that she was nearly eye level with Eleanor. For a long moment, woman and wolf regarded each other through the barrier of glass and 20 years of separation. Then Hope did something that made Patricia gasp aloud. She pressed her nose against the glass and whined, the same sound a dog might make when trying to comfort a distressed human. It was a gesture so gentle, so clearly intended to provide comfort, that Patricia found her hand moving to the door lock despite every rational thought in her head. Please, Eleanor whispered, let me see what they brought me. Let me say goodbye to my family. Patricia unlocked the door with trembling hands and opened it just enough to reach for the bundle Hope had left. The wolves remained perfectly still, their eyes tracking her movements but showing no signs of aggression. As her fingers closed around the soft bundle, Patricia felt her breath catch. Inside the carefully woven nest of fur and dried vegetation was a human baby, perhaps 6 months old, sleeping peacefully despite the cold. The infant was wrapped in what appeared to be a military-issue blanket, the same type Robert had been buried with, and showed no signs of exposure or distress. Somehow, impossibly, the wolves had not only found this abandoned child but had kept it alive and warm in the Montana wilderness. Bring the baby to me, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her tears. Carefully now. They trust us with their most precious gift. Patricia lifted the sleeping infant, marveling at how warm and healthy it appeared. As she placed the baby in Eleanor's arms, she noticed a note pinned to the blanket, a piece of paper that had somehow survived the elements. Eleanor's hands shook as she unfolded the note, her lips moving silently as she read. Then she looked up at Patricia with an expression of profound understanding. "This baby's name is Hope," she said quietly. "She's the great-granddaughter of Marcus Thompson, the man who tried to kill my wolves 20 years ago." The note, written in a desperate hand, told a heartbreaking story. Marcus's granddaughter had struggled with addiction and homelessness, ultimately abandoning her baby in the wilderness during a mental health crisis. But instead of dying from exposure, the infant had been found by the wolf pack Eleanor had raised. Wolves who remembered the concept of protection and family that she'd taught them decades earlier. "They've been caring for her for weeks," Eleanor continued, her voice filled with awe. "Keeping her warm, bringing her to streams for water, even stealing formula from campsites." She looked down at the sleeping baby, whose peaceful expression suggested she felt completely safe. "They brought her to me because they know I understand about loving someone enough to risk everything for them." Outside, the 4 wolves had formed a protective circle around the cabin, their presence both majestic and peaceful. Hope remained closest to the door, her amber eyes reflecting the warm light from within. As Eleanor held the baby against her chest, the old wolf lifted her head and howled again, not the mournful cry of earlier, but something triumphant and joyful. "She's saying thank you," Eleanor whispered, understanding passing between species in a way that transcended language. "She's saying that love never really ends, it just finds new ways to continue." Patricia watched in amazement as Eleanor, whose memory had been failing for years, suddenly seemed to remember everything clearly. The baby stirred in her arms, opening bright blue eyes that seemed to focus immediately on Eleanor's face. "Hello, little Hope," Eleanor murmured, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she'd once used with 4 orphaned wolf cubs. "Welcome to our family." As if responding to some invisible signal, the wolves began to retreat into the forest, their massive forms disappearing into the darkness as silently as they'd arrived. But Hope lingered for one final moment, her eyes meeting Eleanor's through the window in a farewell that encompassed 20 years of love, loss, and the kind of bond that transcends death itself. Then she too vanished into the night, leaving behind only paw prints in the snow and the greatest gift one generation could give to another: the promise that love, once given freely, would continue to flow forward through time, transforming lives in ways beyond human comprehension. Eleanor held the sleeping baby close, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced since her own children were small. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, 3 generations of love had found each other in the most miraculous way possible. This story reminds us that love doesn't have an expiration date, and neither do we. Eleanor Williams was 53 when she thought her life was over, widowed, childless, forgotten by society. Sound familiar? How many of us have felt invisible after 50, like our best years are behind us? But Eleanor's greatest chapter began when she chose love over fear, purpose over safety. At 73, battling Alzheimer's, she became a mother again, not despite her age, but because of the wisdom and unconditional love that only comes with living fully. Those wolves remembered her kindness across 2 decades because genuine love leaves an indelible mark on every life it touches. Think about the wolves in your own life, the people, causes, or dreams you've nurtured with your whole heart. They remember you too, even when you feel forgotten. Your story isn't ending. It's evolving into something more beautiful than you can imagine. Every act of love you've given is still rippling through the world, creating miracles you may never witness, but that exist because you chose to care deeply. You matter more than you know, and your most important contribution to this world might still be waiting to unfold. What wolves from your past still carry the love you gave them? Have you ever felt like Eleanor, that your most meaningful years were behind you, only to discover new purpose later?